get started. Hopefully people online can hear me. Thanks everyone for joining us, and welcome to our quantitative seminar. My name is Lucy. I'm one of the organizers for this year's Quant7 series. It's a fun lab doing it. So I'll begin with a land acknowledgement. The University of Washington acknowledges the Coast Salish peoples of this land, the land which touches the shared waters of all bands and tribes in the Suquamish, Tulalip, and Muckleshoot Nations. Our lab also acknowledges that we live and work on the ancestral lands of the Duwamish people, the first people of Seattle. And now to introduce our speaker. Our speaker today is Dr. Alaia Morell. And she started a postdoc fellowship in September at the Puget Sound Institute at the University of Washington, and she's currently based at SACS. The goal of the postdoc is to explore the impacts of climate change, nutrients, and contaminants on Puget Sound using an ecosystem modeling approach. And she recently defended her PhD thesis at Ifremer in France on fisheries and climate-induced evolution and plasticity impacts on fish communities, also using an ecosystem modeling approach. And with that, let's welcome Alaia.
Work, which is about eco-evolutionary dynamics of the North Sea. You know the North Sea, but you know the North Sea, it's the sea of the North Sea of Europe. It's not super picture of the North Sea. Okay, so my main topic here is about evolution induced by anthropogenic pressure and how it can impact ecosystem. And when I speak about evolution, I speak precisely about the evolution of life history traits, which are the traits related to period, investment, or success. And those traits can be impacted by those pressures, mainly climate change or fishing. If we see more detail about it, so the fishing pressure can impact the evolutionary dynamic of life history traits because of two processes. One is the increase of the total adult mortality, and the other one is the size selectivity. The first one will mainly accelerate the life cycle, that is to say, younger maturation, and also an increase of the allocation to reproduction efforts. And the scientific will have no impact on growth with a decrease in growth. And if we look at what we know about the impact of climate change, we expect climate change to also maybe increase the adult mortality. So it could have similar impact than fishing mortality, but we know a little less about that for now. Okay, so fishing and climate change can impact history traits through evolution. And as example, some traits that can be impacted, so size and age at maturation, growth, so size and age, but also reproductive efforts, so the quantitative traits. And why it is important to study the change of this trait at the level of the population or at the level of the ecosystem, it's because it can impact the entire ecosystem, modifying, for example, demographic rates, but and at the level of also socioeconomic consequences, such as decrease in cash, but also loss of the value of the cash. Cash is the size of the fish. Okay, so for all these reasons, it was interesting to study the impact of life change on the ecosystem. So it's because it impacts ecological dynamics and modify marine socio-ecosystem. But for now, most of the ecosystem model for all ecosystem model, almost all doesn't take into account the life history traits processes. So whereas we think it could be interesting to integrate these processes into marine ecosystem model because when we use this kind of model to define our projection in the future, when we don't take into account evolution, we can modify the projection we do in terms of biomass, catches, or size at age, for example. So one of my first goal during my PhD was to include this dynamic in a marine ecosystem model to use it to answer some questions. So the first question that was interesting to explore with the model I developed, or some model I developed within a bigger marine ecosystem model, was what is the evolutionary impact of fishing when you study it at the level of the ecosystem and of the population, so within the trophic network, and also what can be the impacts of this evolutionary change in the future, and more precisely in the future under climate change scenarios. So to start, I will introduce you the model that I use and the new specificity that I developed to be able to tackle this question in the model. So I used the ecosystem model Osmos, which is a marine ecosystem model, mainly focused on fish. This model is individually based and spatially explicit. The model describes the movement. The movement in this model is random within the area of distribution of fish. The model also describes the predation. A predation event occurs between a predator and a prey if they are in the same cell at the same time step, and if the prey is small enough to be eaten by the predator. The model also describes the life history traits, like the growth, the maturation, and the reproduction. And yeah, during my PhD, I changed this part to include a bioenergetic submodel to describe mechanistically those different traits, to include the trade-off in terms of evolution between the evolution of each trait, but also to include some plastic phenotypy of these traits in the model, but it's not the part I will take here. So, model that we added in the model, it's a biphasic model. That is to say that there is two phases of growth that are different with the life of the fish. One which is the juvenile part, and one other which is the adult part. We have chosen this kind of model because it's very well suited to describe fish growth, and we have added to this model the possibility to vary with physical condition in the system, so with temperature and with oxygen. And we have added also the possibility of the traits to evolve. Here I will mainly be focused in the evolution of two traits, maturation and reproduction efforts. So to go quickly into more detail of the model. So the model describes all the allocation of energy of the fish from ingestion to growth in terms of somatic growth and gonadic growth. So the ingested energy will depend on the size of the fish, but also the trade they are available. Part of that is assimilated, part of that is mobilized. That is to say, mobilized to pay internal processes. The first internal processes detail is that the mobilized energy depend on temperature and oxygen, and then all the life history will depend on that too. So the mobilized energy will primarily be used to pay the maintenance with waves of individual and with temperature. And if it remains of energy, it will be allocated to some growth processes. The way it is allocated between different growth processes depends on maturation states, which is determined by a parameter determining the maturation timing. This parameter is important in our model because it can evolve, and then it allows us to make evolve the maturation process. When the fish are not mature, all their energy goes to somatic growth, and when they become mature, that energy is shared between somatic growth and gonadic growth. the part allocated to gonadic growth increase with the weight of the individual. So that's the big fish allocate almost all the energy to gonadic growth. And the speed of switch to gonadic growth is determined by a parameter that you can see here, but which is the gonadosomatic index. And this is also a parameter that can evolve in our model, and that allows us to represent the evolution of the reproduction traits. So to sum up, we have two traits that are allowed to evolve in our model, which are one related to maturation and one related to reproduction efforts. And these two traits are the main traits described as evolving in empirical studies talk about fish-related evolution. Okay, so now a quick description of how we make them evolve. So we have used an approach of adaptive evolution, this is the quantitative genetic approach for trait expression, which is a quite classic approach for evolution of continuous traits. And to follow the value of the trait and to describe the change in the value of the trait, we describe the value of the trait with a finite number of explicit traits. And we want to use the finite number of explicit traits, like that it can allow us to study some questions such as the erosion of genetic diversity in response to fish. So now we have something that describes the value of the trait, and to have genetic evolution, we need to have a transmission also from parents to offspring. So to that, we represent also the transmission, which follow the Mendelian growth, that is to say segregation and random assessment. So what does that mean? Concretely, an offspring will receive one allele for each locus from each parent, and what it will receive at one locus is independent from what it will receive at other locus. And we have also in the model a parametric reproduction, where the individuals that are the more fecund will have more offspring. And like that, the fitness in our model will emerge from this fecundity part, but also from the survival part. Okay. So we have applied this model to the North Sea, which is an ecosystem of the north of Europe. We have represented the period 2010 to 2019. Our model represents the high trophic level species, meaning the fish. So to have the low trophic level species, but also that we need to use another model, couple this model with our model. So for plankton, dentus, oxygen, and temperature field data, we have used the FM model. And the model osmos have been used to represent 15 fish species, 5 small pelagic, 7 demersal species, and 3 flat fish. These 15 species represent more or less more than 90% of the biomass in the list for the fish. We have calibrated the model on biomass catches and length of age data. And we have done additional qualitative validation on diet, maturation, viability, and transmission. So a quick overview of the validation of the model. Here on the right, you have the catch, the target, and the similarity data, the target red and the similarity data in white, and you have the same plot on the right for biomass. And what we see already for catches is that we reach the data, we reach the target for almost all the species, which is a good news because the catch data are very reliable data. And for biomass, the model do a great job to reaching the target for 10 out of the 13 species.
Len?
Yeah.
Where do the targets come from?
For the catches, the target comes from ICIS data, and for the biomass, it comes from stock assessment data.
I guess I'm trying to figure out so it's a range.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's a range for the period 2010 to 2019, because obviously we
Okay.
don't have the same data all the years. So.
Got it.
And it's a TAC or it's a reference score? Is it a total allowable catch? Like a catch limit? That's not it.
The reported catch.
Oh. Oh, okay. So that's the data. The gray bars are the
grid
data.
of the data, and the whites are what the performance of the reference. And here you have the same comparison, but for size at age data. So the pink are the observed, the blue are the simulated one, and that time the observed data come from survey data. And yeah, for scientific data, the model to also make sure because all the species have the good range of size, and they have like the correct pattern of growth, this flow pattern pattern. So now that we have this model that reproduces quite correctly the data, we have used it for different questions. And the first one is the trait evolution in response to multiple pressure. First pressure is fishing, but when we study fishing in a trophic web, we have obviously another pressure that's coming in addition to fishing, which is predation. So here we have studied this community of 15 species, and we have included evolution for all the species. And in this model, just for you to know, the fishing mortality increases with size, and for almost all the species, and the predation mortality decreases with size, because as the predation is size-based, then the smaller you are, the more you get. And our expectation about the results was to observe like the classic pattern of fisheries and evolution for all the species. Because in the North Sea, almost all the species face an intense fishing pressure. And on the data we have in the North Sea, almost all species have an acceleration of life cycle. But no, sorry. And that means earlier maturation at smaller sizes and an increasing reproductive efforts. We have observed that for only half of the species, for half of the species, yeah, we had this increase of efforts and earlier maturation, like the observed the acceleration of the life history. And those species were the species for which we observed or for which we simulated a fishing mortality that was higher than the predation mortality. And for the species that has the opposite pattern, so a decrease of efforts and a delayed timing of maturation, it was the contrary. The predation mortality was higher than fishing mortality. So yeah, here it could have been expected. So obviously, the fish and the population evolved in response to the main pressure. And what was really interesting here, it was that with a model that is calibrated on food data, catch data, biomass data, but we have also estimated the ingestion for the growth. We could have some species for which predation is higher than fishing, and that's induced this reverse pattern. So that means that the predation mortality necessary to reverse the fishery and evolution pattern is in a range that is not that far than the fishing pressure for some species. So to sum up these parts, we saw that predation can counterbalance the evolutionary impact of fishing. And I think the next step that would be interesting would be to calculate the selection gradient of fishing and of predation to find what is this point that can counterbalance evolutionary trend between fishing and predation. And I think that maybe that could be useful for management, but only if we see that when we introduce evolutionary trends in future prediction, they have big impact on the future state of the ecosystem. So that leads to my second question, is what are the evolutionary impacts of evolutionary dynamics in future projection under climate change. So, yeah, to explore this question, we went back to simulation, and this time we have introduced fishing pressure, predation pressure, but also climate change pressure with the scenario SCP 8.5 for now. And we have done 4 scenarios that we have compared, one without evolution and for climate change, one with evolution in addition to that, one with only climate change, and one with both. Each time we do a bunch of replicates because osmosis is stochastic, and like that we can have the range future possible of possible futures. And we have done a simulation for the period 2010 to the end of the century. And the first results about the projection that I want to show you are about aggregated results for biomass and yield. So here what you can see is the change in terms of biomass and in terms of yield, same for all the species of the model. For the scenarios with climate change, and in black, you have the scenario without evolution, and in red, the scenario with evolution. So if we look at the biomass on the left first, we see that in both scenarios, we have a decrease of biomass over time. And we see also that the 2 scenarios are quite close, even if we see a slight bigger, a very small, bigger decrease with evolution than without. This change is very small and not very significant. The story is totally different when we look at the yield. If we look at the scenario in black without evolution, we see a decrease of the yield, which is around 7% to 8% of decrease. And we see a lot bigger decrease when we exclude evolution, a value of 15% more or less. So yes, what we can see about this big picture about the yield is that that is twice bigger with evolution than without.
Alaia,
Yeah.
how is yield? Okay, is fishing pressure dynamic in this model, or is it given a fixed level of fishing? Because what I'm trying to reconcile is
what we have in the model.
why the yield goes up and biomass stays the same. Yeah.
Yeah,
and
we have a fixed fishing mortality per size class.
Okay.
So yeah, basically what's underlying that, I think, is a decrease in terms of size due to evolution in response to fishing, but maybe also in response to climate change. And as they go smaller, they get better to the fishing pressure. And then the biomass doesn't change because they are just more, the fish are more abundant, but smaller. And then
I got it. Okay, so they're sneaking under the size that normally gets captured.
yeah, that's the main idea here.
And the envelope that is the different simulations and the different responses by species.
You mean the range? The range is the range between different replicates because the model is stochastic. And then we do different simulations to have the whole range of possibility between the simulation and the main line, the mean, the average.
Sorry, I did forget to say, I think that the preference was for questions after the
Oh,
talk. Sorry, I forgot to say that. That's me.
Yeah, that's
But,
okay.
if this is okay with you. Okay.
That is the big picture. I don't know. You would expect, if we go within each species, there is this big discrepancy, big difference between the response of each species. So what I did after was to look at the difference between species. So for that, I have compared I have estimated the percent change in terms of 3 indicators between the beginning and the end of the simulation. So for biomass, for yield, and for mean size, for all the species, and for all the scenarios. Here you can just see the constant climate and no evolution scenarios. And when it is green, it is an increase of biomass. Red or orange is decrease of biomass, and this gray is stable. So for example, here the biomass of Norway that increase. So the constant climate scenario is not exactly stable because under the current condition of the North Sea, some species are just collapsing, and it is what we observe in the data. It is the case for cod, but also salt, and we couldn't stabilize them in the model too. Okay, so if we just add evolution and keep constant climate, what we already see is that we have additional consequences along systems. Species that we thought would be stable become unstable, here decrease, but also here additional increase, for example. And if we add this time climate impacts, we see that without evolution, the climate impact already has a lot of impacts for all the indicators, for all the species. And that's, if we compare the scenario without climate with evolution and the one here with climate without evolution, we see that the first level of impact is of course climate change. And that's the level of impact that as evolution is at the second level of impact. But if we go deeper in the comparison of the scenario with climate change and evolution, we see that sometimes when we don't include evolution, we can do a big mistake in the prediction. If we consider that evolution is what will happen in reality. So let's look further at that. The first main difference, I think, is at the level of the mean size indicator. If we look at the scenario without evolution, here, mean size is almost stable for all species. If we add evolution at the time, half of the species have impact on the mean size. New species with a decrease of size mainly. But if we look at the level of each species, we can see a lot of different patterns. We didn't see any rule to say, okay, that is the global rule that's species going to have evolution. For example, here for herring, we see a mitigation. So when we add evolution, the biomass and the yield of the species is less. But we have also opposite trends here for whiting. Without evolution, we would expect an increase of the species, whereas when we account for evolution, species decrease, so the model is completely wrong without evolution. Or also amplification. So as I said, all the case. Here the yield decrease even more with evolution, or here the biomass increase even more with evolution. So yeah, as I said, no rule like with this work, we can say, okay, if you want to account easily for evolution, you could just, add a percent more or decrease or more increase. We have no rule like that. We try to explain our results according to profit level, according to position in water column, also temperature preference. But yeah, we couldn't illustrate. We couldn't highlight just one rule. So to sum up these parts, we saw, at least for this case study, that evolution does not impact the total biomass at the level of the entire community, but the total catches is strongly affected. As evolution reduces the volume of the catches, but also reduce size, you can think that it could have important economic consequences. I know that the team I was working with will work on this aspect after I left. So about the consequences and the level of the economy of the evolution dynamics. So subject inflation. So when we see the level of impact at the level of fisheries, we can see that it could be interesting to limit the emission induced by fishing. And then the idea I had with the first one of the presentation to try to find a balance, the point that balance. And fishing could be maybe something. No, for this side aspects. So before we end, I wanted to thank you to have listened to listen to me, and also I wanted to thank all the people I was working with because they are very great. Thank you.
Is in the model scenarios, biomass overall conserved? I was thinking about those last scenarios I looked at. It's hard to tell exactly from the color things, but there were definitely winners and losers. You say across all of those taxa, are they going up or down? In those
Like the sum of everything. Yeah, the total biomass is still decreasing, you know, it's still decreasing. The winner and the loser are not the same when you account for evolution or when you lost. Total biomass seems to remain stable. And I think it's also linked because for the model with the level model, and then the total biomass for primary production, but also for zooplankton, it's always the same in these two scenarios. So we still have the same carrying capacity. And then even if the size of the fish change, even if the species are not the same, but not the loser, the total biomass.
Thanks. On the spot, can you help me understand why, like for instance, for biomass, it kind of goes down for a while and then there's like a sharp peak at like 2045 maybe? Like what drives all of the replicates to have the same trend that year?
But again, I would go in this direction if I need to do an hypothesis. Probably that the biomass of phytoplankton and zooplankton that force the model maybe show an increase at that period that force all the simulation to the same increase. I think I really need to see what's happened.
Because like the only external driver, I think, is the climate projections. So is there like something in the climate projections that has a pattern like that?
Yeah, that's what I wanted to say. Yeah, maybe there is something in the climate prediction, but for the biomass that we put in the model in terms of rate, I think maybe temperature and oxygen could explain this pattern, but I mainly think that an increase of zooplankton and zooplankton.
Yeah, I think I'm just surprised that it's not more uniform.
Yeah, I was too. Yeah, I didn't explore more the possibility here, so I can't answer with a. Yeah, I think that confirms that.
So the temperature is only affecting the life history characteristics, or is it also affecting the movement?
Here the temperature and oxygen affects the physiology, but it doesn't affect the movement. Because at first we wanted to see with the current adaptive potential and without movements what will happen. Most of the models do the contrary with fish that follow their optimal temperature and no adaptation.
Yeah, thanks, Alaia. I wondered, we generally see and theory expects that warming temperatures fish will grow initially more rapidly, but then reach a smaller asymptotic size. And did your bioenergetics model capture that?
Normally, yes, it will depend on the initial value of the temperature in the North Sea and the preferred temperature of the
Oh,
species.
yeah.
Because we have a response that increase until the preferred temperature and after that decrease. So if the temperature of the North Sea is already above the preferred temperature of the species, yes, we will observe that's a decrease in.
Right.
But if the species prefer one temperature, then we will see the contrary. And I can show that here, but if we look, for example, at the change of biomass in terms of separate species that prefer one temperature and cold temperature, it's crazy that how different is the response. Biomass on the day.
Yeah, I guess it might be interesting to look at some of the, like this system has been so studied with respect to that question of asking things like cod, and probably maybe herring, or herring cod. But yeah, like at least with cod, does cod show, a lower asymptotic weight and with time forcing and model would be interesting to know.
Yeah, for the size, I don't exactly remember the so but for sure in terms of biomass. It collapsed in any case, but food management it collapsed even after.
Yeah.
And we have put in the model species that are not that abundant in the model, but that are more and more abundant. Nowadays is show that increase. And what we see in the model is that species take the place.
Here's a question online from Jimmy and Ellie. The naive question from non-geneticists: how does one separate evolution or adaptation effects from simple non-adaptive density-dependent factors? Also, does your method account for species with different generation times? How important is that? Big question.
Yeah, I just want to read this.
Yeah.
Sure to fully that question.
Jim, if you want to unmute yourself, you're welcome to.
I think you said it better than I could.
Like, do I understand correctly that your question is you want to know how I disentangle the effect that comes from a change in biomass in the model that impacts climate age and change that come from evolutionary change and change in terms of traits that come from evolutionary and genetic change. That is correct.
Yeah. So I guess imagine that there were no genetic changes, but density dependence kicked in because there was more food. And
yes. So I have two parts of response. I have two pieces of response. The first one is that the output of genetic value of the traits. So the traits for each individual has a genetic value, and on top of that we add the phenotypic noise. So we know exactly the trait that expressed in terms of genetic value, in terms of phenotypic value, and after that we can also have the final phenotype that we simulate with the model. So with all this information that we can simulate in output of our model, we can disentangle each pass, and also we can compare simulation with and without evolution, making with the addition of evolution for all the species, but we can also do species by species to try to separate more we can all the different impacts. And Does our method account for species with different incubation time? I think so, because I mean, in our model, we represent explicitly all the life cycle with a different maturation time, with a different lifespanning, and then some species in the time of the simulation will have several generations and will reproduce more than others that have with long how important is that? I don't really know. I don't explore this part. Yeah, I don't exactly know. I think that, well, I have no idea. What I could say is that we see in the data more variability in the life history trait of species that live many years. And these species, like cod, like sails, all the species that respond more to fishing, pressure, but also because they have more variation, just the traits. So we see bigger response from species than short lifespan. That is indirectly linked to the lifespan.
I'm curious, you might not have an answer for this, but it seems, if I'm interpreting things right, there's some like directional selective pressures in this model. Do you see, because you're looking at an evolutionary genetic model, do you see a loss of genetic diversity coming out of it because there's such like directional selection? Or does this climate, I also kind of have that same like, or does this climate variability kind of, you don't get as much directional selection, you get some more like.
Yeah, that's a good question. I explore a little that, and I have a technical part of this of the answer, which is it depends also how we parameterize that, because for each trait we could change the value of locus coding for the traits, or we can change the number of allele per locus. This is a theoretical way to represent the genome. We don't have the exact genome coding for the traits. And the more we add allele, the less we see. And the more we add locus, the less we see in terms of allele locus. And the less allele we have, the more loss we see. Because the less allele and the less locus we have, the more each allele per locus will have a big effect. And if it is a bad effect, it will be directly controlled. Whereas when all the allele have very small effects, there is more random parts that keep all the pool, and the pool will be closer than the pool we have at the initialization. That being said, I remember that we also see faster lose of the allele for species with a short time of generation. That's also linked with the question.
Just interesting. Also, I'm thinking about like if you change, like if you reduce fishing pressure, like what is the genetic pool that you have to kind of recover the fishery?
Yes. Yeah, that's what
It's a real, I would just say it's a really cool framework, and there's so many assumptions that go into it, but there's a lot of questions that you could probably play around with.
Yeah, and we can play with species pressure, but also with the shape of selectivity that also can totally change the evolutionary pressure. Also, we can think about spatial management that could be totally different evolutionary trajectory. So yeah, I think in terms of impact on genetic biodiversity, there is a lot to do, and it's something that is not very explored now. So yeah, I think it's a good framework to do that, but yeah, still a lot to explore.
My question, I guess, is related to Tim's question from earlier in this yield plot, right? You said these were all projected under constant fishing mortality, was that right?
Yeah, constant mortality plus constant.
For size class, do you see that? I mean, I guess. Does that seem very realistic? No.
No, I don't think so. Like, if people start to catch less because the fish and people, maybe they will actually modify detail of that yield. Again, it's a lot, of course. But that could have worse impacts, I think, on the evolutionary parts. Yeah, then they will become even smaller and smaller. Whereas here, when they start to escape the fishing pressure, after that, the size should remain stable because of the same fishing pressure anymore.
Because I guess I think I'm thinking about this in the context of Chinese fisheries too, right? They also experience quite a lot of changes in life history because of heavy fishing pressure or evolutionary plasticity. And the fish are getting smaller, but they mature so much faster now. And so I think their catches have remained relatively stable,
Okay.
just because there's just a lot of smaller fish, but they take the smaller fish too.
Yeah. So if you change your gear to catch smaller fish, you will catch them. But even smaller size, or if the size stop to reduce, you can reduce the diversity. So but you still have evolutionary impacts on the system. Yeah, we talk a lot about the size selectivity to reduce the minimum size of your catch. But if you change the shape also, if you just take the shape of a trawler, but you take the shape of I don't have English first.
Like first thing, maybe.
Yeah, the gill nets.
Oh, goodness.
Gill nets or something that is more like a bell shape instead of a sigmoid. You can also reverse the evolutionary trend. It's totally different. That live, for example, the big fish, on the repecker, and that live the reserve of some alien system. Yeah, the trend is totally different if you look.
There are no more questions online or in the room. Thank you if anyone else has questions. No? Okay, cool. If no one else has questions, thank you so much for your talk. This was great. And thanks for coming to Quant Seminar. We will see you next week.